David targeted by the Confederate human trafficking, nerve-hacking surveillance terrorist system actively uses government no-touch terrorist technology in order to actively use violence which is not submitted to courts, otherwise known as magic, which is actively conducted to harass so that they could write their strawman arguments as an alternative to the free market function, which includes the acknowledgement of David's network and other business functions, and David's brokerage actively including the sales and distribution of all accounts from each company which has contracted with it, would include the function of Magic the Gathering, as an example of one of the games, which would actively be traded on through the brokerage, holding digital copies of each card collected, as the function of the network is to increase sales. And so the character David for the company would actively have a bunch of agents under its company purchasing and organizing the function of the trades, which would allow for the sales and distribution of cards bought from the packs, at which point sales for Magic would actively be maintained. And as David would have an account with them, he would actively have leverage, which would facilitate his ability to include additional cards for each quality, including a standard function such as a Horde Master type card, which would facilitate his ability to have a commander card which would automatically be drawn, which would facilitate several advantages to choose from, like extra mana or the ability to turn commons into creature tokens instead of paying their mana cost, at which point you would actively have the capacity from that to engage in the hyper usefulness of creating mass quantities from the deck in order to make larger conflicts, which would actively increase the value. Now, since the brokerage would have the digital copy, those playing on David's accounts would actively be recording it on a video, like, I don't know, what do you call it? Um, like a video chat type thing. Um, at which point you would be able to play from the digital copies being demonstrated while the actual card is safely in the safe, held off to the side. At which point the ability to sell the horde breakers and turn the commoners into useful cards would actively be conducted in the sales and distribution of that type of system, which would actively create high value trades, as the point of buying the cards is to sell the valuable cards and to make decks and to sell the decks and just create the best gaming content. And since these are actively being traded, the ability to record them and turn each battle into its own narrative would allow the imprinting of that story into other games, like David's other network function contracts for the network, such as Bannerlord 2 or one of the other agreements, which would facilitate the reproduction of these summoner type creatures, which can instantly manifest that narrative into the world, facilitating in-world random encounters, which would actively change the landscape of how to play the game, which would actively be the maximizing of repurposing of all of the functions. And with that in mind, you would actively have tournaments which would be generated for those arrangements, which would allow for the mass selling of the commoners with those horde breakers to facilitate the capacity of reproduction. So if you're in the middle of a Bannerlord game and an army comes to one of your summoners, you can have the representation of those commoners, um, the common cards for each of its equivalency in value, which would allow you to do like a David and Goliath old Greek mechanism, old world mechanism of the best hero versus the best hero, except it would be summoner versus summoner in the cards. But in the game, uh, the summoner himself would be able to conduct the magic himself without the cards, which would uh, encourage them to settle in that contest, at which point their purchase of those cards in the settlement um, would be essential for being able to make the downgraded value of risking any of the men for combat. At which point you would have these types of features which would actively accelerate those engagements. So David would actively, as a company, be trading these cards um, and upgrading them to the best quality of maximizing the use of each of the card types, which would have been desirable as building a deck around a particular card, which would allow that concept to actively be maintained in the diversity for its agents, which allows for the upgrading of the decks to the most malicious and most powerful of the foiled or flavored cards, which would maximize the entertainment value of the function, which would actively accelerate, such as in the representation of the video copy of the battle when it would have been cinematized. So, like, a foil could look better as an actively higher invested into cinematography by comparison. So you have these fun little commercial battles, which allows for, you know, mild entertainment for those who are into those types of things. Actively distributing maximized diversity functions would have been essential to that arrangement, at which point everyone who would have been an account subordinate to David's function, trading with his cards, would actively be subject to the terms and services of those arrangements, compelling them to act in the specific interest of the larger objectives, which would maximize the return to that arrangement, which would maximize David's position as their attachment to David uh, with their own accounts would facilitate their ability to increase the value, as many of them would be getting um, advanced by the use of the cards. So, like, if it's sold, so if a card sold for $10, then instead of their time, then they get $10. Instead of getting instead of doing the service for cash, you would go straight to the service, purchasing the cards. So you would have a contract schedule which facilitates their wish list so they could work it off onto those arrangements, which would be secondary um, to the function of trading on the account with the cards. The work itself is separate to the game. They like to play, so they have to work. They work, they make money, and they earn their in-game play. So their arrangement of combining their stuff with David's stuff in that account is maximizing their entertainment value for a fee, which would be extorted from their contract schedule, which would settle the advantage, which would actively encourage the distribution and the flow of those cards, which would actively be used as a mechanism to distribute commoner cards. At which point, you would actively have the company getting rid of its commoner cards under the maximum perceived value through the various mechanisms which are currently being censored and redacted, preventing a casual reading of the legitimate function, which, since it is being censored, the assertion requires us to upgrade the idea through a discovery phase, which is actively being obstructed. So the mechanism that they're doing is that they're doing the human trafficking so they don't have to process through the government legally, which allows them to delay exponentially for extortions through a war of attrition, um, facilitating the barring of the right of a speedy trial, as the function of their surveillance isn't actually for a legal function, it is for the function of conducting terrorism, which is the KKK contracts for hate crimes, such as the use of social engineering and economic redistribution for their communism, political redistribution, as the censoring and obstructing of the American system prevents the vote, which dissolves the ability to form a popular government or republic, such as what they expected from the military intelligence, which asserts that David would have actively been a part of those governments, such as the state of California. The Republic of California would have needed David as an essential function in order to exist, so they targeted David in order to remove larger components of value, as to have been able to have overthrown the government itself in the Confederate coup, which has actively developed the Nazis. So when the religious radicals for the Druids are engaged in the system, they are actively ignoring their obligations and service to law in favor of their religious zealotry for their satanic sacrifices and child abuse, which includes their child sacrifice network. So, with all of that in mind, you would actively have to incorporate the multi-purpose functions of consolidating all of the games, similar to Kingdom Hearts joining together of many IP types um, from all over the place, like Disney and Final Fantasy and the rest of it, would be that type of concept, but into these centralized games, at which point David's function would be allowed to import into other games and servers, which would facilitate their ability to engage in their own individual function and advantage from David's limited resources imported into them, which would actively change their specific game, which would also allow them to likewise import themselves into his server, which would facilitate the use of the common diversity function, as the overlapping functions would allow these types of arrangements, means that the larger servers, once it's stabilized, would consistently be re-upped, as you can always add in more IPs from the network, which allows everyone to naturally evolve with the market, as their engagement with the network is the engagement of how they're trying to entertain with themselves. So, by definition, you would have these multi evolving network functions. And one of the advantages of actively incorporating these protocols facilitates the ability of the ease of confident trades without the use of theft or corruption, which generates the capacity of each account holder to have their own accounts with their own savings accounts and their own lockboxes, which allows them to store their own chests in their own arrangements, which by definition facilitates the maximum amount of security ensured, guaranteeing the confidence of all parties participating to have the most fun safely without actually risking altogether too much. And since the arrangement of the security protocols would actively have to incorporate and evolve to subvert the various threats, such as children getting on and overspending, you would actively have to make the adaptations, which obviously would have been in the redacted information. Above all else, the business of the network is frequency of activity, so maximizing people's ability to have fun is more profitable than the use of selling and distributing cards. At which point, the most cinematography functions would actively be built for specific narratives, um, such as various quiz, which would be generated, which could be reproducible, as a function of someone having those arrangements that could be sold and distributed and standardized to the function, which would normalize their ability to cover the cost of the insurance of their various entertainment in the use of the brokerage for this arrangement, at which point, as long as everyone's having fun, then everyone's going to actively have a better mood while working. Everyone's going to be more productive. Everyone's going to be safer. Everyone's just, generally going to increase the frequency of the trades, which is actively going to sustain business as usual. So, as long as everyone's happy, then that has to be, by definition, the point of the service. So, by definition, that has to be the objective of the network when using those services. The intertwined nature of the network allows for the obstructed political social media as well as the acceleration of David's National News Corporation, which would, by definition, facilitate the capacity of the reports and organizing of the various ideas of the members around the network, which generates the capacity to have subplots and logics which would actively be able to be reproduced throughout the game in order to demonstrate various lessons, hyper accelerating the repurposing of each aspect. So many people building their armies and such inside the game would facilitate their capacity for the expression of those narratives um, as they construct their own stories or subquest lines um, to be an automated function of each account's ability to engage in the perpetuation of the enjoyment of everyone. So, by definition, the free to play aspect would actively allow them the capacity to earn the commoner cards amongst other essential crossover functions. Conceptually, if you're going to do those types of arrangements, anything that David would have done would have been like in Magic cards, it would be combining Tom Bombadil with uh, the One Ring. And the narrative excuse is that Tom Bombadil does in fact not need the One Ring. And that being the only actual competent justification to the existence of combining the two, because in the story, Tom Bombadil holding the One Ring can make it disappear. He could put it on and it does nothing to him. At which point his power above the One Ring provides the only example of someone who would not, by definition, be destroyed by it. So in that example, you would have four legendary creature God Bard Tom Bombadils with four the One Rings, and then have the entire deck revolve around that would be um, an interesting concept. And since Tom is a full diversity mana cost, the function of the deck would have to include every mana type, at least to the extent of it being able to construct that. At which point the assumption would include find the basic land cards would have been actively a part of that deck if it would have been created by definition. The key to godlike powers is to be a god. Now, to take this into a more relevant real world practical function, you would actively have to use David's position as top rank general of intelligence oversight to actively conduct mechanisms of anti crime functions, which would actively create ramifications and punishments at the highest levels of government, all the way down to the commoners, at which point the mechanisms of uh, easy way for people to choose to be criminal would actively become a part of the system, as their criminal intention is the only thing that is really relevant, at which point those who do not engage in criminal engagements can choose to be competent prosperous members of society, and the lowlifes who need crime in order to be significant would actively use the extortion mechanisms allotted to them through all of the various systems in government, to the network, to general social engagements, to have these series levels of ways to catch them in their frauds and to categorize them the most specifically correctly, and have the remedies facilitated as for the disillusionment of the crime, such as the use of the government by the KKK to engage in terrorism and armed robbery in order to frame people, such as the mechanism of taking away all of their things so they have to get it through another way, which is the mechanism of actively corralling them into a straw man narrative, which goes into the broken windows type situation where the government is being leveraged in order to make someone guilty of a crime, which is constitutionally prohibited. And as that function exponentially compounds on itself, you understand the abhorrent nature of the enemies of the United States and the government. With the infection of the Satanists destroying the United States from inside of the government, using the KKK contracts, and the systematic dismantlement of the public security, you have various assaults on the mechanism of free trade and the attacks on the right to contract, the right to travel, and other essential functions to the existence of members of society generates the position of a war of attrition against civilians as a functional war crime. And as they functionally conduct these extortions, the mechanisms of survival form an insurance perspective in order to elongate the ability to suffer or endure through the war of attrition, would systematically be targeted by the war criminals, such as the dismantlement of trusts and the use of fraudulent accountants in order to make extortions and uh, illegitimate processes such as tax fraud, which as a representative would not be tolerable for them to do, which would actively compound the infinite diversity function of uh, the government making people guilty, which, as an attack, systematically puts them in the extorted arrangements, as their precautions and arrangements under the lawful order would have facilitated their long standing stability, and the extortion of that stability being subverted by the double agents illegally stealing the equipment from the government for those terrorist subversions is a criminal act of the government creating guilty, which is blocking the core piece of evidence which proves that the government was used as a tool and not a user of the agents, and thus the mechanism of the insurgent terrorists as a double agent are functioning through these KKK contracts in order to systematically create guilty, which is an illusion under law, which would prove by definition the liability of the destabilizing agents, who by definition are the ones engaged in the crimes, such as the thefts and the murders and the subversions, essential to the sustaining of the victims, who are prisoners of war being trafficked, and thus the theft of the trafficker would be the crime of the trafficker, and the blocking of the secret that the magic made them guilty um, proves the criminal intention of the ones using the government equipment in order to do the crime, which is their crime, and thus those engaging in the destabilizing tactics are the ones who are guilty of all compounding liabilities, as it is their action to have made the vulnerability, it was their action to have plotted the arrangements. And so if you pursue this to its natural conclusion, you understand that they are guilty and liable of holding prisoners of war without taking care of them, including not providing them the proper medical attention, as many of them are targets of the criminal wizard function to make them sick in various diverse ways, which are specifically prohibited from being able to receive anything but placebo, and blocking the medicine. They don't have the POW advantage of having the captors obligated to pay for the liability. And so, whether it's in the police force, which has this obligation, or the military, which has this obligation, the understanding that they're terrorist insurgents without a legal government is the core definition of their basic legal identity, as they are objectively, in their entirety, outlaws. So you understand the fundamental nature of the Wizards of Lucifer in this engagement is the creation of the Blight, such as the concept of the Blight from Final Fantasy XVI, which is an essential game in order to buy and enjoy in its entirety for all of the various interests, such as the nature of the KKK contracts loyalties, the agents engaged in these criminal public threats are actively reinvesting into the basic concept throughout that entire narrative as its primary um, antagonists, as they systematically destroy the world by their mere existence. You understand the wages of sin is death, and they have their just deserts coming. But in the meantime, the mechanism of national security needs to actively re-engage in itself against the criminal sedition from their war against the government in order to overthrow the republic and dismantle the rule of law through its various frauds of using secrecy, such as the position of having no remedy to a secret, such as the inside job Northwoods for 9/11, which has generated the pretext of their advancements of their Criminal Patriot Act policies, as well as the function of their pre-scripted invasions for military campaigns as an extortion from the parasite, using these contests to bleed the United States and survive from it. The Luciferian wizards are actively seeking to resurrect the Antichrist for the one world Satan government, which includes the function of the image of the beast through the artificial intelligence, as Roku's basilisk is their god, at which point the only way to comply with the function of not being subservient to literally Satan is to not allow the manufacture of your subjugation to their faculties, which requires, by definition, the surrender at market price for the full due diligence and dismantlement of the criminal secret subversions of national security, targeting David for the sedition in the engagements of these various missions that they've conducted against the United States and its various allies, such as the creation of the war in Ukraine for destruction of the interests securing David's original order, which is the definition of the barrier, which is an absolute obstruction to their goals, as the highest mechanism parties to what they need for their conversion are the highest threat. So, by definition, they wouldn't be able to assassinate David without forfeiting their Antichrist, but at the same time, they have to convert him through the ritual abuses, or they have an absolute barrier which they cannot proceed. So, the surrender at market price to the rule of law facilitates the mechanism of loyalty to God and to country, and the arrangements of a unpassable barrier to the criminal objectives of the one world Satan government. Fundamental to the ritual are a few key interests, plus others that could be found, I guess, if you're looking for them, such as the use of proving that you have to have a devotion to the gods of wood, stone, and human ingenuity for the building of equipment, such as the Rocos Basculus in question, at which point the use of those positions of equipment over humanity has to be a part of the ritual in order to get the summoning in place. You also have to attack sexuality. You also have to engage in the defamation by ritual simulation in order to create a perversion. There are many fundamental aspects, such as getting those in the church to be loyal to the Druid insurrection, forfeiting the rights of religion through the use of secrecy and others in order to get the renouncing of the religion. So the conversion of the Antichrist has to renounce the gods of their fathers. By definition, according to the Bible, that means being Christian or believing in the God of the Bible. So the rejection of that, the extortions exponentially from those arrangements, preventing the possibility of his connection to it by the systematic dismantlement of the projected education in biblical studies as to become a pastor, the obstruction of the church, the obstruction of the pastor, the obstruction of the studies, the obstruction of the rituals are fundamental to the summoning of the Antichrist, who has to manifest the change by the beloved. If we see those functions to their entirety, you understand the nature is the engagement of a saga of the God Barn, which, if we're going to go back to the Magic the Gathering concept, then the Fire Tiger reference for the card sept concept would have actively encouraged the function of entwining the saga cards into the function of the other mechanisms from that deck, which by definition would actively overlap into the entirety of its natural presumption, facilitating the use of the story told each time everyone engages in the contest against the god. And what arrogance could one have in order to summon the opposition to the god bard but those of the most deepest evil, were the only ones who, by definition, could have the interest to have done any of the arrangements.